From the glaciers of Tibet to the rice fields of Vietnam, one river connects 6 countries and over 70 million people. But that same river, the Mekong, is now one of the most engineered on Earth. Hello, listeners, and welcome to H2O and Beyond. My name is Alex Hahn, and each week we dive into the science, systems, and stories behind the water we use every day. Today's episode is actually a pretty special one. It's my first time covering anything international. As you know, in our previous episodes, we've been mostly covering things like the Salton Sea and the Great Salt Lake, for example. But yeah, today we're heading over on a trip to Southeast Asia, and I'm super excited. And so joining me here today is Mr. Brian Eyler, the director of the Energy, Water, and Sustainability Program at the Stimson Center. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. Eyler. It's great to have you on the show today.
Brian.
So before we start, I usually like to ask my guests to tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and the place you work at.
Sure. Well, I direct the Stimson Center's Southeast Asia program and also our Energy, Water, and Sustainability program. And the Stimson Center is a think tank in Washington, D.C. We like to call ourselves a medium-sized think tank that punches above its weight. And the center works on a range of traditional and non-traditional security issues. My team works on water security issues, also energy and food security issues in Southeast Asia.
So since you guys are a think tank, does this mean you guys help create policies that help help the people of the United States? Like, because I remember like a few episodes ago we had Texas 2036, another think tank, and what they do is sort of take data and analyze it and then advise policymakers on how to make their policies. Is that similar to what you guys do?
That's similar to what we do, but we not only try to inform better policymaking in the United States, but also the rest of the world. So I'm happy to say that our work has helped inform planners and water planning in the Mekong region, all the way from China to Vietnam, from the top of the river system to the bottom. And we're beginning to work in other parts of the world too, as well as Nepal, on hazard issues, natural hazards in the Himalayas, and expanding our toolkit to achieve impact in other parts of the world. It's a great job. It's great to see communities who are benefiting from our work, as well as our ability to inform policymakers to make better decisions.
Oh, I see. So you guys advise policymakers not just in America, but also around the world to help shape theirs, right?
Yes. There's a robust global discussion about water security broadly. And then our projects seek to inform policymakers in countries like Thailand and Vietnam and Cambodia.
Yeah, and what you do is pretty interesting. And I want to ask, like, what brought you into this line of work?
Oh man, that's a good question. I'm like more than 2 decades into working on the Mekong now. And I originally was a China person by training, China's economy, politics, history. And I lived in China for 15 years. But early on in my experience in China, I came across the Mekong, particularly during my graduate school days. And a friend of mine encouraged me to study Southeast Asia. And when I was in a grad school class, Southeast Asian economics at UC San Diego, the professor, Chris Sampantarak, said about how trade was increasing between China and Thailand on the Mekong River. And I raised my hand and I said, "What do you mean?" And this is more than 20 years ago. I was just there a few years ago in China on the Mekong, and I saw no boats going up and down the river. And he's like, "I don't know. I just read about this in The Economist. Why don't you go check it out?" And he offered me a research grant to go check that out and make that my summer research project. And from there, I was hooked. I went from China down into Thailand and Laos, saw the river for the first time. And, it just got me from there. And I haven't looked back since.
I think it's great that, going to college gives you all these opportunities to explore, and, you somehow ended up on the other side of the world, and this is what you're doing for a living. So it was really interesting. Now going on into the episode, I want to assume that our listeners know nothing about the Mekong River. Can you like paint a picture of where it starts to where it finishes in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, well, the river runs about 4,000 kilometers from the Tibetan Plateau in
Mhm.
China. Um, about half of its length is in China, and then it enters into Southeast Asia, cutting through parts of Laos and Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Um, in China, it's relatively narrow
Mhm.
because it's cutting through mountains like the Himalayas, through these tight river canyons. But then as the river gets into its downstream portion, the basin fans out. And about a third or a little less than a third of Thailand is in the Mekong, a small portion of Myanmar. Nearly all of Laos is in the Mekong basin. So we're talking about the tributaries.
Okay.
Um, and then nearly all of Cambodia is as well. And then Vietnam is both an upstream and a downstream country of the Mekong. It has headwaters of some of the rivers that flow into Cambodia, as well as the mighty Mekong Delta, which is responsible for putting food in every supermarket in the United States.
Could you elaborate more on the putting food in every supermarket of the United States? That sounds pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. So the Mekong is mighty, and it's mighty because
Mhm.
its seasonal flooding casts water wide across its land. And in the Mekong Delta, where the land is relatively flat,
Mhm.
right before the river goes into the ocean, uh, the delta has been transformed into an agricultural production zone in Vietnam and in Cambodia to a degree. And that transformation has happened over the last 200 years. There's a deep history of creating the delta into this breadbasket or grain basket of the world. So Vietnam is one of the world's top rice exporters. Uh, you won't find so much rice from Vietnam in America's
Mhm.
supermarkets, but you will find fish and shrimp and other products as well. Um, Fish and shrimp are now major export products to the United States, and things like tilapia, particularly, and other forms of carp. And yeah, you can get them in our supermarkets. So when we consume those products
Mhm.
here in America, we're consuming the water of the Mekong. And if there are things happening to the Mekong, say by climate change or upstream dams or other effects, then that's going to affect the way that we consume these products.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'm going to the supermarket. I as a kid, I don't really pay attention to where my food comes from. I just kind of follow my
Sure.
mom. She gets the food for me. But yeah, it's really interesting as I might try looking for some of those Asian food products next time.
Yeah. Well, that's a
Mhm.
concept called virtual water. Like we're not actually
Yeah.
drinking the water from the Mekong, but we're using that water here in America. So it's virtual water.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty interesting topic. I'm gonna actually explore that in one of my next episodes. So, I mean, how many people depend like directly on the Mekong that live in this, yeah, that live along the river?
Yeah, the numbers aren't so clear. You
Mhm.
used the word 70 million,
Yeah.
the number 70 million in your intro. That's about right.
Yeah.
I tend to say tens of millions of people
Yeah.
rely on it. It's a large number. We know that. And that means these are people who are, they might be rice producers in
Mhm.
Vietnam, and they're selling their rice to the market. Therefore, they get their income from that rice sale. Or they're people who live right on the river and they get their protein and their sustenance
Mhm.
directly from the river in forms of fish or, say, gardens alongside of the river. And it's not just the Mekong mainstream that does this, the tributaries provide as well. So that's how we get to the numbers of tens of
Nice.
millions of people.
And are there any other industries along the Mekong besides the agricultural one that you mentioned?
Sure. By and large, it the industries of the Mekong are related to agriculture, but there
Mhm.
are some large urban areas along the Mekong as well. Two important capitals, Vientiane, the capital of Laos, Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, and those are industrializing areas, which introduces pollution into the river. There are other things that are polluting the river system too. And then in China, there's Jinghong, which has a population of nearly 1 million people now, which is also an industrializing area. But another important industry for the Mekong or happening on the Mekong is hydropower. So now there are hundreds of dams on tributaries in the mainstream of the Mekong, and mining too. We're learning that there are hundreds of mines happening on or near the river system, posing a threat to the river system.
What types of minerals are they mining in Southeast Asia? And I know China has a bunch of minerals that we use to make our smartphones and things. What minerals are
Yeah,
they using along the Mekong?
that's the stuff that's coming out of the Mekong, and China has actually banned the the extraction of these kinds of rare earth minerals from its own territory, and therefore it pushes the demand or really the supply uh, for those rare earth minerals outside of its borders. China is one of the major consumers of
Hmm.
rare earth minerals in its manufacturing, and those things, as you said, get sent to the rest of the world, like our smartphones, and so we're making another connection, right,
Yeah.
to the water and the basin of the Mekong. And this is actually an issue that's only recently come to light. We've mapped hundreds of different kinds of mines. In the Mekong, there are about just under 100 rare earth mines in Myanmar and Laos that are unregulated. They're not they're not necessarily licensed by the national government. Um, and if we're looking at the effects of pollution on the river, we know some data about some parts of the river that
Hmm.
are being polluted by this mining activity. Um, but because the countries of Myanmar and Laos and the territories in which these mines are, um, there are no kind of environmental rules or regulations that are being applied to that mining activity. So it's a really concerning issue right now.
Does you said China they limit exports on these rare earth minerals? Is that correct?
Currently, yeah, that
Hmm.
happened just last week. So that was an announcement that actually tanked the American markets. Um, but China has banned the extraction of rare earth minerals within its own territory, and therefore that pushes the per pushes its own consumption of rare earths uh, to the outside. It needs to import all of its rare earth materials. China banned its rare earth mining a decade ago or more because of environmental degradation issues. But it's pushed the production of the rare earths now abroad. And they're Chinese miners that are doing it, and they're doing it directly in rivers, and some of those rivers are in the Mekong Basin.
See, I see. So, other foreign companies like those in America, are they now going to get their rare earth minerals from the other countries on the Mekong, do you think?
Indirectly, yes. The material will go to China to be refined and processed, and built into manufactured products like wind turbines or electric vehicles or smartphones or smart screens, um, data centers, the, the the inputs to data centers as well. So in a way, um, there is a direct connection between the mining on the Mekong and the consumption and our consumption of these goods, and the big drive to digitize, to
Yeah.
push a digital economy, as well as the clean energy transition.
Yeah, and I think this development of the Southeast Asian economy provides a nice transition to hydropower, and I know it's developing pretty fast in the area, and I want to know like
Hmm.
how is it affecting like first of all I want to talk how does it physically affect the river when countries dam the Mekong?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are now hundreds of dams on the Mekong River. In fact, more than 700 either completed or under construction, and most of those are completed. And those dams range from small dams on the headwaters of Mekong tributaries in Thailand to some of the largest dams in the world. Say China's two dams on the upstream of the Mekong, two of its 12 that are on the upstream of the Mekong are among the largest in the world. And they hold um, one holds 15 cubic kilometers of water. The other one holds 22 cubic kilometers of water. These are massive amounts of water, nearly as large as like the water behind the Hoover Dam or the Glen Canyon Dam in the United States. The Mekong works. It's mighty in all that rice production and the fisheries. Um, that I mentioned before
Mhm.
uh, is made possible by something called the flood pulse. So the flood pulse is a natural occurrence where there's kind of a peak of water that comes down through the Mekong system as a result of rain every wet season. And that peak of water is huge and it causes seasonal flooding on the Mekong floodplain. And again, it's that flooding that makes the conditions for agriculture and the robust fishery. Just as a factoid, uh, the Mekong is the world's largest inland fishery, and it produces 13 times more fish than all of North America's rivers and lakes combined. It's really
Wow,
impressive.
that is a
Yeah,
lot.
it's really impressive. And it's done by that flood pulse. So, what dams do is dams hold back water during the wet season. They
Mhm.
use the water to fill the reservoirs, and that brings the flood pulse down. So the peak gets shaved or the peak comes down. Um, and then that water in the reservoirs is used to produce hydropower during the dry season. So it's released back into the system. That brings the valley of the flood pulse up. So what's happening is this typical beautiful curve of the Mekong that peaks during the wet season and goes down during the dry season is being flattened. There are lower peaks and there are higher valleys. And that's bringing an effect on fisheries and agricultural production, among other things.
So these dams actually they store the water when you have these flood pulses, right? And then they release it during the dry season for hydropower. Is that how it works?
Yeah, that's how it works. And the reason why they release water during the dry
Mhm.
season is that the price of electricity is high in the dry season. The dry season is the hottest time of the year in the Mekong. That's like, March and February. So dam operators want to make the most money that they can. The electricity price is the highest during this time. So why not use that water to produce electricity during that time of the year?
And I wonder, where do people like get their electricity from then in the wet season? Do they release a little bit of water through the dams, or do they get it through other sources?
Well, the countries of the Mekong, um, each of them gets different portions of their power sector from
Oh, I see. I see.
hydropower. So we're talking about Laos and Cambodia, Vietnam. They all have very different power sectors. China too, and different mixes. So the portion of coal versus a portion of nuclear, so let's say for China, versus natural gas and hydropower is in there as well. So during the wet season, it's likely that those other forms of power generation are being tapped. But to be sure, hydropower is playing a role during the wet season too. Those dams they're releasing some water for hydropower
Mhm.
production as they're filling too.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I didn't really catch it, but how exactly does this like flood pulse affect the fishing industry?
Well, the flood pulse is a positive phenomenon.
Mhm.
The way to see the Mekong in your mind is not like a line on a map.
Okay.
Um, and we get confused by maps because if a river level goes up or down, it's actually increasing in its surface area, right?
Okay.
And when we just look at a map, we see one line and it's that width all the time. In the Mekong, particularly in the lower floodplain, across much of Cambodia and Vietnam's Mekong Delta, an area that's like 250 miles long, the Mekong can be 50 kilometers wide at times during the wet season at its peak. Um, and then it will contract during the dry season to just being
Mhm.
like a kilometer wide. And it kind of expands during the wet season and then contracts and acts as kind of like a heartbeat. And when that expansion happens, fish, and there are like more than 1,000 species of fish in the Mekong system of many different sizes, they wander into the margins of the flooded areas, and they can find food, habitat isolated from predators, and they just grow large and many. And then when the contraction period happens, they migrate, and many of them migrate upstream to spawn again. And it's that kind of the heartbeat effect, the river
Yeah.
expanding and contracting that provides the conditions to make it the largest fishery on the planet.
Yeah, and going back to the dams in China, is the Three Gorges Dam on the Mekong River? I know that's one of China's largest.
Yeah, that's the largest
Mhm.
dam in the world. at least the largest operational dam in the world. That's not on the Mekong.
All
That's
right.
on the Yangtze system, and which is beside the Mekong um, in China. So China's got uh, probably more dams than any country on the planet, at least definitely the largest dams. And many of those dams are clustered in China's southwest, where you have these deep canyons um, that are perfect for building dams. You have a massive elevation drop, and uh, the sides of the mountains are secure in terms of their kind of
Yeah.
geological integrity. It's like a dam builder's dream. So in China, not just on the Mekong, but like on the upper tributaries of the Yangtze River, there are cascades of dams. The Mekong actually has the least in terms of those southwest rivers in China. Other tributaries of the Yangtze River have many more
Hmm.
large dams built on them.
And is China planning on building another one? I know you mentioned they're building, I think another one of the largest in the world on the
Yeah,
Mekong, right?
not on the Mekong.
Oh.
Um, the biggest dams have been built on the Mekong, and the good news, if you will, is that um, it's not going to necessarily get any worse for the
Mhm.
impacts of what China's large dams can do to the downstream in terms of bringing down that flood pulse. The remaining dams to be built will be much smaller than what's already built. Now they're still relatively large, but they're going to be built far upstream of the existing dams in Tibet, in the Tibetan territory. Um, the super dam is not in the Mekong, but it's worth talking about if we want to do a
Yeah.
little segue. That's going to be built on the Brahmaputra River, which runs from Tibet in China, then into India and into Bangladesh before it joins the Ganges system and then enters the Indian Ocean. That dam will produce something like 60 gigawatts of electricity. That's the amount of electricity that the United Kingdom produces. Okay,
Oh.
one dam, and it's actually going to be a system of dams that work together over this 2,000-meter drop in elevation to produce this massive amount of power. Uh, and the super dam, it's really the topic of another podcast. I'd love to do that with you. There are others that are looking at this. Um, it has its own challenges and will deliver its own set of impacts to India and Bangladesh, and it's a hot topic now in those countries.
Yeah, and I see like the question I'm about to ask. You can probably take this through multiple perspectives, but I think this goes back to why does China feel the need to build such large dams?
Mm. There are a lot of reasons for China's dam spree on its rivers. Um, One, I think, historically, rivers are seen as wild entities by
Hmm.
the Chinese elite, and that goes back millennia. Um, Emperors in the past had talked about the need to control rivers and stop flooding, because flooding is seen as a negative thing or a negative impact on the people in China. There are dynasties that fell because of floods.
Yeah.
There are floods that have killed hundreds of thousands of people in China over the China's long history. So China's engineers prefer to dam the rivers in order to control the wild nature of those rivers. Now, contrast that with, I've talked about productive, positive flooding
Hmm.
in the Mekong. There, among Mekongers or people in Cambodia or Vietnam, they see floods in a different way. And in fact, in the language of these countries, uh, those kinds of floods in the lower portions of the Mekong have a positive connotation. And those languages also have floods that have negative connotations, but that's not what is assigned to the floods of the Mekong. Um, Other reasons why China is damming the rivers, well, the dams make a lot of money, and they help to contribute to GDP growth.
Hmm.
These are large construction projects. They employ, scores of people, not more. There are big industries behind them, suppliers of turbines and all the different fixings that go into a dam. So when you're able to, have a sector that has like 1,000 projects, in it, 1,000 dams or so. And you can even export that sector abroad to build dams abroad. It has kind of its own self-serving nature that's really hard to stop politically, even if there are good arguments as to why dams shouldn't be built, and there might be alternatives to them. And then the third reason is China's clean energy transition.
Okay.
You can call it greenwashing, you can call it, a real policy discourse. But I remember a time when I lived in Beijing where the skies were gray all the time, and that was from coal pollution. We like coughed up black stuff in the winter times, and it was bad. And so that there was a need for China to move away from those coal emitting or carbon emitting sources. And dams helped to do that. They were part of the solution. They're not entirely the solution, but they definitely served a part of that pollution. They start part of that solution.
Yeah, and China's a huge power, like superpower, not just in Asia but across the world. But going back to specifically Asia, like, does China ever try to use these dams for political control of other countries? Since they control the, like, I think, at least I know, they control part of the upper sector of the Mekong. Do they ever try to do that?
Right. No, I don't see. I've been watching these dams. We do this on the Mekong Dam Monitor.
Yeah.
We use satellites to watch those dams, and I don't see any evidence of directly, holding back water to try and achieve political outcomes. I don't think there's some type of sinister plan in Beijing to do that. But I think those outcomes happen anyway, because if you control the headwaters of a river, then those who are downstream ultimately perceive that the upstream hegemon is controlling your water source, and they act in a certain way. They become, more, I guess, subservient, particularly if they are weaker. And all the Mekong countries downstream are weaker than China. Yeah. With the super dam, it's a very different situation. India is not a weak country. So it's going to be interesting to see how India's relations with China play out over the super dam system.
Yeah, and how exactly have these countries responded in the ways that you just described?
Well, the responses varied. Laos, which has probably the largest portion of the Mekong Basin, of all the Mekong countries, definitely the largest portion of its national territory, is basically overrun by Chinese investment these days. And political actors who are Chinese likely are involved in nearly every aspect of decision making in Laos. And that's a transition that's happened over the last 10 years. And this has happened because the government there is relatively weak. Laos is kind of set up as a country by its neighbors like Vietnam and Thailand as a buffer zone that had served to prevent those two kind of regional powers from directly clashing with each other. So the buffer zone was kept weak, and that created a vacuum for China to fill over the last 10 years. So in Laos, China's damming discourse has won the Lao elite over, and there are now more than 100 operational dams on tributaries in the mainstream of the Mekong, many of them built by China, not all. And that power from those dams is said to be sent to the neighborhood, to Thailand and Vietnam, and will drive Laos's economic development. But that has not happened. Laos is a country that is increasingly in a bad macroeconomic position. Hyperinflation rules. Its debt load is huge, and particularly its debt to China. Now, the downstream countries like Cambodia and Vietnam often oppose dams upstream in Laos and in China, and they will be vocal about that. Thailand is kind of a mixed bag because Thailand's government also invests in dams in Laos, and so it's got some skin in the game there. But Thai communities are very active against China's dams and other dams in the Mekong. And when you read the news about the Mekong, you're typically reading about activists from Thailand who who are advocating for against the dams or for alternatives to those dams, or talking about how their livelihoods are changing from the impacts of dams.
Yeah, I mean, I see. So, yeah, I think China's doing the same thing in Africa these days, investing heavily in their economy. And so, as part of your job as someone from a think tank, do you ever interact with people from all over like Southeast Asia and try to gain like their perspective? Since I know you explored the region, you talk to these farmers. Is this like where you're getting your information from?
Yeah, most of what I know about the region comes from like the people in Thailand I
Hmm.
mentioned, or activists in Cambodia, or government officials in these countries. As a think tanker, we've got to be talking to these people all the time. So every morning I'm waking up and it's nighttime there. And I'm checking in with people who are watching the river, who are affected by the river. Right now, the Mekong watching community, are all talking about this rare earth pollution issue
Yeah.
that's happening in the region.
Yeah, and when the Mekong's flow changes as a result of these dams, who feels the effects first? Is it like the farmers? Is it everyone downstream, or what is it like?
Um, so the people that, well, I'll illustrate two examples.
Okay.
Um, the people that are affected the most, or the most acutely, are those that are closest to the dams. So China has two of the largest dams in the system, two of the largest dams in the world. Um, and those dams tend to uh, change river levels, again, in the closest areas to them. So in the Golden Triangle in Thailand, um, people have been noting for more than a decade that there is less water during the wet season, sorry, and more water during the dry season. And then starting about 8 years ago or so, um, actually more than a decade ago, they noticed fluctuations in the river levels day to day. And sometimes there are these big pulses of water that come down through the river, and they can sweep away livestock or boats that might not be tied up on the banks, or even inundate farms that are growing during the dry season. Um, and that those waves of water come from China's dam releases, and they happen without any warning. So that's one example.
Hmm.
And in those areas, I used to observe really amazing fishing villages, where everybody fished. They're out in the river every day. They're catching lots of fish and then taking them to market. Most of those fishing villages have turned into ghost towns in the Golden Triangle. And that's a result, again, of the big dams. But another example is often from small dams, and climate change is creating more intense weather patterns. So one of the things we're observing week to week, and this is something we were looking at last week and the week before, as these big typhoons hit the Mekong system,
Hmm.
is that reservoirs, they're filling up during the wet
Yeah.
season. We're now kind of coming to the end of the wet season, some major weather coming through, and those reservoirs are high. So what they have to do is they need to release their water, um, in order to not have the reservoir overtopped. And if a reservoir overtops, meaning it goes over the top of the dam, it can destroy the dam or cause some really serious damage. So they release the water quickly, and that causes flooding without any warning. And then the typhoon comes, and it causes even worse flooding. So there's kind of a double whammy effect to these typhoons now. And that can happen with small dams. And it particularly happens with small dams because they tend to fill up quickly.
Yeah, and going back to the earlier part of the episode, you said that these countries in the lower parts of the Mekong River, they usually see these pulses as something positive. But if I guess is it because when you release all that water at once from a dam, it starts having these negative effects?
Well, that's not a pulse. That's just
Okay.
like that's a so when I mentioned the flood pulse, that's once a
Yeah.
year, and
Oh, okay.
it's this kind of mountain of water that starts to build over the course of the wet season and peaks about this time, and then the river level goes down. So it's not a sudden thing; it's rather gradual. Um, these waves of water that come out of the dams, though, they can happen on a day-to-day basis or related to, again, like a typhoon.
Yeah.
Um, or a storm that's coming through.
Yeah, and something we talk a lot about on this channel is climate change, and you just mentioned these typhoons. Is climate change causing these typhoons to become stronger and overtop these basins more frequently?
Um, Local anecdotes definitely suggest that the storms are becoming more intense.
Hmm.
So 2 weeks ago, there was a typhoon, the third to hit in 10 days, uh, that caused the worst flooding in northern Vietnam in 10 years. That wasn't in the Mekong Basin, that was in the Red Basin, the Red River Basin. But that typhoon also passed into the basin, into the Mekong, and caused some flooding. Last year, in August and September, there were two really intense flooding events that caused northern Thailand to flood worse than it had flooded since the 1960s. At least people say, it hasn't flooded this much since the
Hmm.
1960s. So these are becoming more frequent, these intense storms. And there's likely a compounding effect. If you have two happening back to back, the water from the first flood probably hasn't cleared, and
Yeah.
it's going to make the flooding from the second one more intense.
Yeah, and in order to solve these problems, it's often a multi-country issue. How are countries working together to, compromise and solve issues regarding the river? I know the Stimson
Yeah.
Center does this, but are there any other companies that do this?
Well, often in response to floods,
Hmm.
the push is to build more dams,
Oh.
and and that's only going to create more issues and more complexity, um, to manage the system, because dams damage that natural flood pulse. The idea is that with more dams, you can store more water when the floods come, and as opposed to allowing that water to flood a downstream community. So there is this push for more storage. There's always this "let's have more storage"
Hmm.
um, discourse, in any base. I mean, that happens in California too. Um, so there's going to be a tension, between the positive impacts of flooding and the negative. And the Mekong River Commission, which is an intergovernmental organization that, in a sense, oversees the development of the entire basin, at least the lower basin. China's not part of it. Myanmar's not part of it. They produce research that shows, like, the benefits of floods are something like 7 billion, $8 billion a year, to the region, where damage from flooding, is around 70 to $80 million a year. Um, so you're looking at magnitudes more benefits than negative impacts. But those equations might be changing, as the flooding becomes more intense.
Yeah, I want to hear your perspective. What do you think like the solution would be instead of building more dams, or do you think that's the
Yeah.
best way to solve this?
Well, looking at the data week to week on the Mekong Dam
Yeah.
Monitor, uh, we're seeing that the the early parts of the wet season are becoming drier, uh, and the later parts of the wet season are having these more intense typhoons. So, at least that part of the season is somewhat normal, or even higher than normal in terms of precipitation. However, we're seeing dams fill during the early months of the wet season. They take the water when it's there. It's drier, but it's not like super dry. Um, so when the rains happen, the reservoirs fill up. Um, our general advocacy is for these reservoir operators to wait. And if they can wait, then the early portions of that flood pulse, June, July, will give the ecology of the Mekong a chance to flood and do its work.
Hmm.
Um, and then, if dam operators, um, are ready, they'll take the water during the end of the wet season, like now, or the end
Yeah.
of September, October, and they can still fill up the reservoirs. Um, so that's one of our recommendations. And then also, we watch the expansion of the flood pulse downstream on a
Yeah.
weekly basis, and we know when the precipitation is forecasted, and we know the position of the reservoirs. So much so that we can say, in our advice, we're not necessarily picking up the phone and calling dam operators, but in our general advice that we put out there publicly, we say, hey, things are looking good with the expansion right now. Let it do its work. Maybe wait 1 or 2 weeks to restrict water.
Yeah.
looking at certain conditions. So it's kind of like near real-time predictive capacity, um, where dam operators can be generally better informed about how to operate their dams in a way that reduces their impacts downstream or minimizes their impacts downstream. So all of that's possible. It's just not being put to use. And um, operators of infrastructure around natural resources generally want to take the stuff when they can. Uh, if they don't, they think they might not get it next week, or if they don't, the next guy downstream is going to take it. So this kind of take all mentality needs to be broken, and technology can offer a way
Yeah.
forward through that.
And how is this something the Stimson Center does? Are you guys the ones putting out like these recommendations?
Yes, that's what we do on a weekly basis. And in addition to telling the story of how the river's working. So, for
Yeah.
example, I just wrapped up our dam monitor work for the day, and we've found that for the first time in 7 years, the Mekong flood pulse in early October was really normal.
Oh.
Uh, and this was a good thing. So, we actually have good news for the river system this week. There was something like 21,500 square kilometers of flooding. That's a lot in the lower basin. And we can say from this that the fisheries, which happen in December and January by and large, are going to be really good. And likely the agricultural production for the year will be quite good. So, for once in a long time, we have good news to share, and we like to tell that story in different ways to different audiences.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to ask, like, what you said, like this year was the first in 7 years that it's been sort of normal. What was it like these past few years then?
Um, well, I shouldn't say. So 2018 was pretty good, and
Okay,
2022 was
yeah.
pretty good too. But 2025 was higher than those two um, by a couple hundred square kilometers. So all that's great. Um, but there was this string of low flow years uh, in 2019, 2020, and 2021 where climate change or a climate because of a lack of rain during the wet season, the river was running really low, and dams were actually taking a lot of water out during that time as well. So dams were exacerbating a drought that was climate driven, and the fisheries were down reportedly year on year, something like 70% in Cambodia, um, year after year after year. And so we were really worried about a food crisis playing out in Cambodia. Thankfully, it didn't. And all that was during COVID, too. So reporting wasn't very transparent. Not a lot of information was getting out. But again, anecdotally, fisheries were down 70% during that tough time.
Yeah. And international relations are a big part of the U.S. government. Does the U.S. have any interest regarding the river? Are they doing anything to
Yeah.
help mediate discussions between these different countries?
Well, America is kind of the reason why the dams are there in the first place. So in the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson wanted to develop dams on the Mekong as a way to get the North Vietnamese to the negotiation table to say, hey, if we can stop this war, we can develop these dams together and bring economic development to all of Southeast Asia. What
Okay.
do you say? Ho Chi Minh said, I'm not interested. And the war kept going. And I think that was the right decision to make. And thankfully, those dams didn't get made because, the all of the good scientific study for dams being built today show that dams are a bad idea on the mainstream for the Mekong. Um, the dams, if they were built as they were designed in the 1960s, they'd be even worse. Um, so, fast forward into the 1990s, and the countries of the Mekong dust off all those plans and say, let's start doing this. That's a really quick summary of how it happened. But the United States is active, the government is active in the Mekong. We've got food imports that we're bringing in from the Mekong, so it's important to keep those coming in. There are food safety concerns around this as well. And so what we've seen are let me say a few other things. the U.S. is greatly loved and respected in many of the lower Mekong
Hmm.
countries, uh, and that's that's from Thailand to Cambodia to Laos to Vietnam. So we're mostly welcome to assist and support with their development needs and through foreign assistance funding, through like USAID projects, which aren't happening anymore as a result of what happened in January with the Doge cuts. Um, but at the same time, the U.S. Through government agencies, let's say like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which can help with technical solutions to flood management issues, to our universities, which obviously are not governmental, which are doing a lot of work on fisheries and agricultural solutions for the Mekong. We've got a deep footprint there. And as somebody who works on the Mekong, kind of sits and watches all this happening, I'm really impressed with the way that the U.S. engages broadly in the Mekong region
Yeah, and
until now, when a lot of the funding has been reduced.
yeah, I think it's really cool that these organizations, these universities in the U.S. are willing to help out these other countries in Southeast Asia. And I didn't even know the U.S. was the Corps of Engineers actually had the ability to work outside the country. So I think it is really cool what they're doing.
Yeah, the Army Corps has its own detractors within the United States. Let's be sure about that. But they also have kind of their own foreign policy arm to go out
Mhm.
and teach other countries and other actors, stakeholders in these countries how to manage rivers.
Yeah, and I think like part of my goal is to one day I know our state's flagship research university, Georgia Tech, they do a bunch
Mhm.
of these cool projects regarding civil environmental engineering. So I think it'd be really neat if one day even I go somewhere like that and
Yeah, go
help them
for
out.
it.
Yeah, and what gives you hope towards the future of the Mekong?
Um, right now with this rare earth mining pollution issue, I don't know if I have much hope for the river system, and it might be the first time that I've said this. The solutions that I mentioned earlier can be
Mhm.
helpful for managing dams and trying to, say, emulate the flood pulse rather than push it down and take away from the Mekong's ecology. But mining is just, it's only now becoming to be understood the impact that rare earth mining and gold mining is having on the river system. And in two provinces in Thailand, where a transboundary river comes out of Myanmar, flows through Chiang Mai and Chiang Rai province in Thailand, and then into the Mekong mainstream, there are two rare earth mines in Myanmar that are causing the entire agricultural output of those two provinces, at least for all of Chiang Rai province, to be seen as pariah in Thailand because it's perceived to be contaminated by heavy metals. So we're talking about a population of like 1 million people, many of whom are farmers. Uh, and they fish out of these tributaries too. And there's no fishing happening on those tributaries. So food is being taken away, income is being taken away, livelihoods are really struggling there. And that's just from two of these mines. And again, we're seeing hundreds of mines um, now developing across rare earths and gold mining, and no testing being done to show what the impacts of that mining is on health outcomes and food safety outcomes throughout the basin. So right now we're pushing for more transparency. We're pushing for more testing to be done. It's taking up 80% of what we do right now. And one of my fears is that a river system that is known to be, clean and productive and
Mhm.
can produce more fish than any other river on the planet will now be seen as one that is one of the most polluted on the planet as a result of this rampant mining activity.
Yeah, I've done some of my own research on what these mines do. They dump these toxic metals into the river, it destroys ecosystems, it harms us humans if you rely directly on the river for food. So yeah, it's just there's a bunch of stuff going on over there.
Yeah, it's devastating. I have a few mentors from whom I learn a lot. I mean, I learn a lot from anyone who's working on the Mekong, but there are a few people who I look up to. When they write something, I read all their stuff.
Yeah.
They're my go-to people when I don't know how to work through a problem or want to talk through a solution. And one of them is a man named Miwat Roykal, in northern Thailand, and he leads those advocates in northern Thailand that I talked about earlier. He's called this rare earth mining pollution issue the atomic bomb for the Mekong. And I mean, that's a scary framing. It's a scary analogy. And I think in a few years, we're going to find out as the effects of exposure to these contaminants start to sink in, there's going to be a large number of people affected by it.
Yeah, and so you said this rare earth mining deal is something that has your like work at the Stimson Center now shifted towards solving this issue?
We're shining a light on the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Solving it is going to be a matter of
Yeah.
diplomacy, high level talks between Thailand, China, Myanmar, Laos, and or um, let's say shifting away global reliance on rare earths
Yeah.
from China, which is going to be really hard to do because we we consume all these products that are coming out of China, and they're made by American companies too. Um, so our job is to promote transparency, bring science and evidence to the issue to show what more needs to be done and where the solution might come from.
Yeah, I see. And as we wrap up the episode, are there any last words you would like to share with our audience, Mr. Eiler?
Um, well, I just think we need to think about the big global trends, particularly around AI, digital economy,
Mm-hmm.
the things that are putting more and more of our life uh, into interacting with the screen or some type of digital technology. We often don't think, and I'm not an opponent of all of this, but we don't think about the way that the demand for the inputs that go into making those things affect people far away across the world. It's taking away their food sources, it's taking away their water sources. There are ethical and sustainable ways to do this, probably. We're not quite there yet, but we need to search for solutions. And we need to better understand the impacts that our own actions have on, again, communities that are really far, far away from us.
Yeah, it's great that we have all this new AI technology. Like, hey, I can generate an image with a few sentences, but a lot of us don't realize like something I want to explore later on in this podcast is the hidden use of water in AI.
Right.
It takes a lot of water
Sure.
to cool these data centers, and
Indeed.
as you mentioned, these rare earth minerals to create these chips. A lot of people don't think about it. So yeah, I think it's going to become a really important and big deal for people in the future to know exactly what goes into the technologies they use.
Right. Right. And I'll end with kind of a crazy statement, but um, to save the planet and save our rivers and the people that rely on them, we might have to get this stuff from outer space. Um,
Oh, the
because the
asteroids,
other
right? The asteroids is this?
potentially, yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
the other alternatives are the deserts, which there might be space for that, or the seabeds, which come with their own huge
yeah,
potential environmental and ecological implications. And seabed mining for some of this stuff is really beginning to take off. Um, and, I think a way forward might be to pause, to rethink, to think about alternatives. But if it's going to continue, it could continue in outer space. It's not going to happen in the next 5 years, but it'll probably happen within your lifetime, Alex. So that's something that either you can be part of or observe or push for with your good work.
yeah. A lot of these solutions, they're not so clear cut. It's often you have to take a little from this industry, take a little from that industry. It's not as simple as hey, let's just cut this rare earth mining from the rivers and let's just go to outer space immediately. I
Right.
think
It's
it's
not going to
gonna,
happen tomorrow.
yeah, it's gonna take a lot of cooperation between different industries to help solve these problems. Yeah. Well, Mr. Eiler, thank you so much today for joining me on H2O and Beyond. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Happy to be here, Alex. Take care.
Thank you. Well, listeners, hopefully you enjoyed our first international edition of this episode of H2O and Beyond. And if you found it helpful, please feel free to share it with your coworkers and friends. And if you want to be a guest on the podcast or have any feedback or suggestions, there's a Google form in the description. And I'll also link some resources such as the website to the Stimson Center and more resources you can learn about the Mekong through. And finally, make sure to check out the link tree as well in our bio to follow and subscribe to the H2O and Beyond socials. I'm Alex. Thank you for listening to H2O and Beyond. Stay curious and stay hydrated.